It's okay, go ahead, keep on eating. I hope everybody's enjoying the day so far and had a good time in our morning sessions. I think things are off to a great start, and we've got a really terrific afternoon lined up, and that starts with our speaker at lunch today, Dan Roam. I'm a little bit nervous about this because there's an inherent danger in introducing a guy who's just written a book called Blah, Blah, Blah. That is, that you will be held out as the example of what to avoid. So I'm going to cross my fingers, keep it brief, and hope for the best. Dan Roam says that when words don't work, thinking doesn't work. As someone in the word business, that makes me a little nervous too. But he says words have become our default thinking tool, which is killing our ability to think, lead, and solve problems. What he wants us to focus on is vivid thinking, a way to break through the verbal clutter. Dan started to explore this concept in his previous book, The Back of the Napkin, Solving Problems and Selling Ideas with Pictures, which in 2008 was Fast Company's Best Business Book of the Year and Business Week's Innovation and Design Book of the Year. So now he's back with the new book, Blah, 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 and you have copies of it, and I understand they are signed copies of it, just published this month, which provides a systematic approach to clarifying even the most complicated subjects. And government, as everyone in this room knows, tends to deal in some rather complicated subjects. Dan lectures and speaks across the country and has brought his techniques to such clients as Google, eBay, Microsoft, Walmart, Wells Fargo Bank, News Corporation, the Navy, and the United States Senate. So Dan, all I can say is if you can teach senators not to blah, 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 this crowd is a piece of cake. Dan Roam.
Let me get my technology set up here really quickly for you. You know, it is a real pleasure to be able to be here. I managed to get out to D.C., I'd say about once a quarter or so. I live out in San Francisco, and I've always found it's really good, it's really refreshing for me to have a chance to come back and visit all of you out here, because I've got to tell you, you know, sometimes sitting in the outer fringes of our country, we look to Washington, D.C., and we say, why can't those people get their act together? Why is it that everything is so difficult? Why is it that no decisions are being made? And the thing that's always good when I come here is I have a chance to sit down and talk with people who are actually working here. And it completely resets my mind because I come to realize that the things you have to do in running government is the most critical and the most difficult thing that anybody has to do. I think about this, and you probably think about this all the time, but again, from the outside perspective, over all the way from San Francisco, I think you have to make every day some of the most incredibly difficult decisions under the most incredibly difficult timelines with certainly something far less than perfect information. And you've got to do it consistently, and you've got to do it well, and you've got to do it over and over. And it's clear to me why sometimes when we're sitting out there and we're watching the messages that are coming out of D.C., unfortunately, a lot of it starts to look like that. But I don't want this conversation for the rest of our lunch to be a negative one. I want it to be a positive one because I believe, as Tom was saying, that the right way to think about this is there is a way out of the blah, blah, blah. What I would like to share with you today, really, is a very simple little tool. Tom already mentioned it, something that I call vivid thinking, and I'll explore with you what that term means, that is something that you will be able to take with you after you've left this lunch. And I mean that literally, because you'll notice that on your tables, under the little red table tents in the middle, you have some paper napkins. I hope, does everybody have a pen? Is there anybody who's going to need a pen? Because I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of drawing on that napkin as we explore what visual thinking is and as we start to explore what vivid thinking are. Because these are the tools that are going to help us make sure that from this lunch forward, none of us in this room will ever be the person that was accused of any of the blah, blah, blah. We'll have the tool to get away from it. So the way I really like to start this is I really like to think that putting everything in context, I like to start with two case studies two projects that I have worked on that to me really represent sort of the bookends of what I think works really well in communications and thinking and what does not work particularly well in communications. So on the positive side, I like to start with this image. I was asked a couple of years ago to come up to Seattle to work with the project managers that are overseeing the development of the new 787. So this is Boeing's newest product, arguably one of the most complex machines that has ever been made. And I'm sure many of you can probably sympathize with the challenges that are involved in trying to create a single system that is actually composed of hundreds of thousands of other little subsystems, and they all have to fit together and they all have to work perfectly together. Well, the things that they told me up in Seattle that really was remarkable doubles up the challenge, because in the case of the 787, it's not just that there are lots of different components, but those components are being built in 25 different countries by people speaking 15 different languages at the same time. So think about how difficult this must be. If I am building any of the components that are here shown in blue, that means I'm in the United States. Any part that you see up here that's in green is being manufactured in Italy. Any part that's in red is being manufactured in Japan. Yellow is being manufactured in China, and so on, to 25 different countries. Now, how is it possible, when I don't speak the same language as you at all, that I could be sitting in my country working on my component and know perfectly how it's going to integrate in with your component? So in fact, what happens is all the pieces get sent back to Seattle and they snap together just like a big model airplane and everything works. How is that possible? It's a miracle of communication in a complex system. And what the folks at Boeing showed me is that's possible because everything is communicated with pictures. And it's not just sophisticated computer-aided design. They've actually come up with an entire iconographic visual language that is completely spoken language free. So I could be in any one of those places and know by looking at the pictures exactly what I'm supposed to do, and we can all work in perfect concert. And I thought, that's really remarkable. I really like that idea. The use of pictures and visual thinking made so real. You might remember, I said a moment ago I was going to tell you two case studies. The one where communications works really well, and now I want to tell you another one. Because on the other end of the spectrum, I have had an opportunity on a couple of occasions now to come and work with various groups within the United States Senate. And I have to tell you this, it has been remarkable to me to see how hard people are working, how much people are getting done, how challenging the circumstances are and the decisions that need to be made. And into the end of the day, are there any pictures to be seen anywhere? Does any one hand really know what the other one expects of it? Every piece of communication ends up being delivered in something that looks kind of like that. And I think here is where we have the root of one of our challenges. Of course, every decision that all of us need to make is impacted by lots of other decisions by lots of other people. Of course, everything is very complicated. Of course, we need to get into the details, but not when we introduce the idea. The details we need to save for later on. And this is really the point of vivid thinking, is how do we introduce an idea in a way that people are going to be able to understand it up front, so that then they're willing to take the time to try to understand it as it gets more and more complicated. So when I think about vivid thinking, and this is really the essence of what you're going to find in your book, blah, 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 if you do take a chance to read it, vivid is a mnemonic. I have to tell you right up front, I have a terrible memory. And I'm always trying to look for mnemonic devices or things, memory hooks that are going to help me. And I came across this idea of vivid a couple of years ago, because I realized if you really look at it, what we're spelling out is VI stands for visual, V stands for verbal, and ID stands for interdependent. So what we're really talking about here is not just talking with words, nor just illustrating with pictures, but what would happen if we were to force our visual capacity to interact with our verbal capacity in an interdependent way. We're going to talk about this a lot more in detail as we go, but really that's the essential idea. And you know, we all know that vivid thinking is a very powerful way to get people to want to do things that are complicated. And I spend probably the first chapter in my book talking about the story of Dr. Seuss And where did Dr. Seuss come from? And how is it? Let me ask you, by a show of hands, how many people in here have ever read a Dr. Seuss book? It's going to be every single person. Probably, I'm willing to guess that almost everybody in this room, at some point when they were learning to read, was helped by Dr. Seuss. There's a whole story. He just didn't appear out of nowhere. Dr. Seuss came about because of some really rigorous thinking that was being done in the 1950s. In those days, people were very concerned that kids were not learning to read very well, and they were not going to be good citizens, for the reason that there was this new technology that had entered into the market that was distracting kids from reading. And that, of course, was television. And the nation was convinced that television was going to lead us to being a bunch of illiterate, uncivil people. And so a lot of studies were done that said, you know, they said a lot of things. One of the things those studies said is if you want to get kids to read, kids do want to learn to read. The problem is that the books that we're teaching them to read with are really dry and really boring. In particular, the pictures are really terrible. You know, little Johnny climbed up the hill. So they asked Ted Geisel to come in with this crazy way of drawing, these miraculous animals and circuses, and combine that with words that were fun to read because they rhymed. And all of a sudden, kids want to learn to read. The underlying result, the underlying takeaway from all of this was that if we present people information that they need to learn in a way that they find appealing, they want to learn it. And so the thought I have, where vivid thinking comes in, is given the incredible range of challenges and difficult things that we need to understand now, why wouldn't we use the same tools? And it's not an issue of being childish. It's not an issue of being unserious. It's an issue of taking advantage of the fact that something like 60% of every neuron in our brain is focused on vision. We have more mental capacity dedicated to the processing of vision than any other thing that we do. It's pretty fascinating when you think about that because we knew that when we were little. Well, let me ask you this. How many people in here have kids who are in kindergarten or have been through kindergarten? Raise your hands if you would. It's a fair number. And how many of you yourselves have been through kindergarten and made it out the other side, you know? If you haven't, go ahead and raise your hand anyway. We don't want to. What I'd like you to do for a moment is just think about this, a nice little mental exercise. If you had an opportunity to walk into a kindergarten class, and of course, with the teacher's permission, ask those little 5- and 6-year-olds 2 questions. The first question is, okay, little ones, raise your hand if you know how to draw. What's going to happen? Every kid's going to raise their hand. They can all do that. And then ask them the second question, and how many of you can read and write? And 2 hands are going to go up. And one kid's putting their hand up only because they know when they're asked a question, they're supposed to raise their hand. But one probably really can read and write, but that's pretty exceptional. In kindergarten, it's usually about 1 in 10 kids is starting to become literate, able to read. Well, the point I'd like to make is imagine if you had a chance to then come back to that class 10 years later, a bunch of 16-year-olds sitting in 10th grade, and you ask the same 2 questions. What would happen? Okay, young adults, how many of you can draw? Now you're going to get maybe 2 tentative hands in the air. And how many of you can read and write? Yep, every hand's going to go up. I can do that. Now, something has shifted, and I don't want you to get me wrong. There's absolutely nothing wrong, Tom, with the need to learn to read and write. That is absolutely critical. But what is wrong, what is fundamentally wrong, is that we spent that time from when we were 6 to 16 to 26 to 46 to 66 rigorously learning tools to help out our verbal mind. We learned grammar, we learned sentence structure, we learned vocabulary, we learned how to spell. Did anybody ever give us a tool, a single actual tool, to help us take advantage of the 65% of our brain that understands the world through the visual? No. And that is what we're going to fix. And thank goodness we have the rest of the lunch to do it. All right, so as we get started down this path of vivid thinking, visual, verbal, interdependent thinking, I want to start it off by just introducing the one unwritten rule of why vivid thinking actually works. Why is this powerful stuff? The rule says this: whoever best describes the problem is the person most likely to solve the problem. Now, what I mean by that, it's a pretty simple little mental exercise. If someone came running into your office, waving their hand, saying, "Oh my gosh, the sky's falling, give me money to fix it," you'd probably say, "Stop, no." But if the same person came into your room and they said, we know we have a problem. I've been out mapping the players, and it appears to me that when these people are interacting in these ways at these times, these roadblocks continually try to come up. If you give me some money, I will continue to explore this so we can fix it. The real issue here is that the person who takes the time to vividly map out the pieces of the problem is the person who is already beginning to see the solution. An effective mapping of a problem always contains within it the solution. It's always there. Now, the issue becomes one of simply seeing it, choosing the right solution, and then, frankly, having the political will to move ahead to make it happen. But the real mercenary sort of subtext here is this. Whoever finds the vivid form of the idea is the person who finds the funding. The person who draws the best picture is the person who gets the funding. Let me show. We don't actually believe this, but this is actually true. And let me show you a couple of examples. So, I live out here in the Bay Area, and as I mentioned, a couple of years ago, I was initially asked by the New Policy Committee of the United States Senate to come out and do a half-day workshop here. So, I do not have a background in politics or economics. So, I started to do my research, trying to look for really good examples of simple pictures that had made a great difference in the political arena. I've got hundreds of them from business, but I didn't have very many from the public sector. So I started to do my research, and I found some, but I found something else, even more interesting, that I want to share with you. So this is a map of Mount Vernon. Now, Mount Vernon, of course, was George Washington's estate, just outside of where we are right now. Would anyone like to guess who might have drawn this map? And the date is up here, 1766. 1766. Would anyone like to guess who might have drawn this map? The hint is the only name I've given you so far. Yes, I didn't know this. It turns out, it turns out that George Washington had been trained as a map maker and a surveyor, and he drew all the time. His notebooks are full of his sketches. I thought, that's interesting. That's not something that I was taught in high school civics class. So let's continue. This is a piece of Oval Office stationery where some president is drawing a picture of a boat, something that looks like a chessboard with an eraser, kind of interesting, a NATO flag, blockade Cuba in a circle, Castro in a box. Would anyone like to guess who might have drawn this picture? Absolutely. JFK drew that picture. In fact, those are the notes that he was taking when he was on the phone with Premier Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Those are his notes. That is how he was thinking. Now, thought there's another one. Somebody always gets this right. Another president, someone who clearly had a lot on his mind. Yes, someone always gets it right. Richard Nixon. That is an interesting drawing. You know, it's kind of interesting because there are people who've gone out and they've done forensic IQ tests on all the U.S. presidents based on publicly accessible writings, public speeches, trying to deduce what was the level of intelligence of all the various presidents. And it turns out that Nixon was probably one of the smartest men who's ever been in the White House. Clearly from that drawing, he also had a lot on his mind. Now here's a nice easy one. Would anyone like to care to guess who might have drawn these pictures? This is easy. So those are some of the drawings that Ronald Reagan did when he was in office. And I got to go back for a second. You know, I have made a career out of trying to draw complex ideas in a simple way, and I'll tell you the most complex thing I've ever come across to draw is a horse. I don't know how many of you have ever tried to draw a horse, but that is a pretty good-looking horse. Who knew our president had that kind of talent? It's not something that's typically talked about. So I gave my workshop, and I shared it with the folks from the New Policy Committee, and at the end of the time, a guy named Doug Steiger, who at that time was head of the Democratic side of the New Policy Committee, came up to me and he said, Dan, I have the perfect back-of-the-napkin, simple picture story for you from politics. He told me this story, and I checked it out. This is true. We have to go back to the year 1974, when Ford was president, and an economist named Arthur Laffer. So Arthur Laffer was a USC economist, very conservative in his fiscal views, and a real friend of the Ford administration. One night, Laffer went out to a bar here in Washington with 2 senior aides to President Ford. And we don't know what they were drinking, but we know what they were talking about and we know what they were drawing because eventually it became a matter of public record in a really significant way. So what happened is, at the bar, Laffer pulled out one of the cocktail napkins off the bar and he said, "Guys, we're talking about taxes. I want to draw you something I've been thinking about." And on his napkin, he drew a very simple XY plot. And on the horizontal axis, he said, "Okay, we're talking about taxes, so let's plot out the percent tax rate that the government charges us on our income from 0% up to 100%. And on the vertical axis, let's plot out how much money the government actually collects from tax revenue, from $0 up to lots and lots of dollars." He says, "Okay, guys, now stay with me. If the government charges us 0% income tax, how much money is the government going to bring in?" 0. It's not a trick question. If, he said, however, if the government charges us 100% income tax, how much money is the government going to bring in? Also 0, because no one will work. If we have to pay every penny of every dollar that we've ever earned straight through our pocket right back out into the tax coffers, well, what's the point? I mean, just kick back, go to the beach. I mean, what's the point of doing anything? So what he said is, "Gentlemen, it would appear that there must be some sort of a curve that goes like this. And at some point along that curve, isn't it interesting that the more we reduce the rate of taxation, the more money we actually collect?" Now, the 2 guys who were sitting with him in the bar that night are these 2 guys. And they said, "That napkin's fascinating. Can we take that back to President Ford? I'll bet he would find that idea intriguing." "Absolutely," said Laffer. Those 2 guys took the napkin back to President Ford. President Ford understood it. He liked it. He passed it on to the Republican National Committee. The RNC then passed it on to the economics team of a guy named Ronald Reagan, who was thinking about running for president. That napkin sketch drawn that night in that bar by those 3 guys literally became the basis for Reaganomics. That is the first public record ever seen of supply-side economics mapped out. Now, what makes this story doubly interesting is that the 2 gentlemen that were sitting in the bar with Laffer that night are those 2 guys. I will say nothing more except ask one question. Who says that a simple little picture is a gross oversimplification or a simple little picture is a childless act? A simple little picture is the single most powerful thing that we can create when we want to get our idea crystallized and get it into someone else's mind in a way that they understand. When we see something, when we see that picture drawn in front of us, accompanied by narration, the words are critical, but the visual is critical, which we'll explore a little bit further as we go through the rest of this lunch. We believe it. It activates our brain in a way that words alone simply cannot do. And we believe in it, and we move on. That's our underlying lesson, but I'd like to try to apply it to where we are today. Joe, I think my machine has just decided to go on the fritz. Would you switch me over to yours? Tell me when you got it up. Is this yours? Okay. This is another picture drawn by another U.S. president. Would anyone like to guess who might have drawn this picture? The hint here, of course, is the B and the O on the bottom of the page. Absolutely right. It turns out that President Obama drew this picture. It turns out that President Obama used to draw all the time. Regardless of where anybody may sit in the political spectrum, everybody acknowledges that President Obama is clearly one of the most articulate public speakers in memory. Words are not enough. We know that our president has the ability to draw. The question I have is, given the range of challenges that we face, that all of you face, why are we not seeing any pictures? Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could get pictures to help us understand in the same way? The Laffer curve to this day is still debated. Is it right? Is it wrong? It doesn't matter. We at least see what we're talking about and we can debate it clearly. The question I have relates specifically, I want to talk for a moment about healthcare reform. This is something that I personally have gotten involved in. I promise you I will not get political in what I want to share with you. I just want to introduce the idea and say that when healthcare reform was first thrown out there, a couple of years ago now, I think we can all safely acknowledge that there was no intention to drive this nation apart in the way that it has. What's wrong with healthcare reform? Why would so many people become so angry they're bringing guns and getting in fights at those town hall meetings? It's like, dude, where's my country? This isn't right. So I thought, I don't think that the problem is that people don't believe or don't like what Washington is telling them. I think the problem is that simply nobody understands what Washington is telling them. And I wanted to test this out. So I thought, in the case of healthcare, I'm going to go right to the source. So I went online and I went to the congressional website and I downloaded House Resolution 3962, which was the first piece of healthcare legislation this round back in October of 2009 that was passed under Nancy Pelosi. And I wanted to see, okay, so if we're not understanding, I want to look at the actual document that people are thinking about and are trying to make their decisions about and see what makes it so difficult. I'm looking for the picture that's going to help me understand, here's where healthcare is today and why we might need to change it, and here's where healthcare will be in the future if we do change it. But let's face it, this is, as you all know, this is a very important government document, so there's no way that there's going to be a picture on the first 2 pages. And so I continued through, and, not surprisingly, we're into the preamble now, and we're starting to get our bullet lists. And then I continued on, and I went through. This is a screenshot of the actual document. You can read it all later if you'd like. And there we have it. It is 1,447 pages of bullet points. I'm sure there are probably people in here who worked on this document. I feel very sorry for you. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to look over this 1,500-page document for a moment and then raise your hand if you're for healthcare reform and keep your hand down if you're against it. All right? Let's go. It's impossible. This is a 1,500-page document that there is nobody on earth who can actually read and make sure that they understand what this is about. So I thought, now I'm beginning to understand. We're beginning to understand what the problem is. What would happen if we tried it with pictures? What would happen if we tried? And no one else was doing it, so I thought, I'll try. Now, I have, as a consultant, worked with a number of different healthcare companies in the past, but I'm by no stretch an expert on the American healthcare system, but I know people who are. And so I contacted a client, a consultant client I've worked with in the past, incredibly smart guy, Dr. Tony Jones down in Los Angeles. Now, Tony has both an MD and an MBA. He's one of the most overeducated people I've ever met. Tony has worked with every major healthcare company in America, and he really does understand how the system works. So I said to Tony, what would happen if I flew down to your office in LA and I bring along printouts of all the legislation? Between your knowledge of how the system actually works, my ability to draw these simple pictures to clarify things, and the legislation, let's just lock ourselves in your office and not leave until we've been able to map out the essentials of healthcare reform, which is what we did. And I'm going to show you just 3 of the pictures. In the end, it took us 43 pictures to do it. I promise I will only take you through the first 3. Picture number 1 looks like this. And it says that the first thing anyone who wants to understand healthcare in America needs to understand is that here uniquely among any developed economy, healthcare in our country is a business. It's a profit-driven business. That's data point number 1 we've got to get our heads around. It's not bad, it's not good, it's simply what we have. The problem is it's not just one business, it's 2. Over on the right side in red, you see the business of providers. These are the doctors and the hospitals and the pharmaceutical companies. I'm going to speak the unspeakable now. These are the people who make a profit off of making us well. On the other side of the balance, over there in the blue side, is another business, the business of the payers. These are the insurance companies. And now I'm going to speak the unspeakable again. These are the people who make a profit off of managing the flow of money between me in the middle and my provider. Now, that by itself wouldn't be so bad, except for the fact that over the last 25 years, those 2 businesses have come to hate each other. And why is that? Because healthcare is a zero-sum game. There is only one source of money going in, as both sides seek to rightfully maximize their profit. There is only one source of money, and that's me at the middle. As an employed, tax-paying American citizen, I am the only source of money that's going into this. So it stands to reason that as both sides rightfully seeks to maximize their profit, I in the middle am the one who's being quashed. And the government, this administration, like many others before it, has looked at this and said it is an unsustainable model as it is set up right now, because the fulcrum point The American citizen is the one who's being squashed. So this administration looked at the balance, and this was the great aha moment for Tony and I reading through the legislation. The Obama administration, in my opinion, made a grave error in calling this health care reform. Because if you looked at the legislation, 99% of what was being reformed was on the insurance side of the balance. There's actually very, very little in any reform that said that doctors needed to perform differently or hospitals needed to act differently. There's some, but it's minimal. In my opinion, had the Obama administration called it right from the beginning insurance reform, it probably would have just flown right through because everybody hates their insurance company. So the point is, I'm not going to share any more of the pictures, but are they pretty clear to understand? There are 43 of them. And if we had a chance to go through them all, if we could be here for the next hour, it's all it takes. I'm sure we could get to a lot of agreement on what is good and what is not good about the system as we have it. But the point I wanted to make is, I drew this set of pictures, and I thought, wow, the act of having gone through this makes me now understand what healthcare reform really is about. And we did map out every major piece of legislation and where it would sit along that spectrum and some others that we put together. But in the end, I took all the pictures, I put them in a PowerPoint document, and I posted them on a website called SlideShare, which is, it's kind of a place where people, it's kind of like YouTube for PowerPoint presentations, which sounds horrible. If you've really got nothing better to do and you're tired of watching video clips on YouTube, feel free to go to SlideShare and you can look at people's PowerPoints all day. So I put it on there, and the remarkable thing is within maybe 2 weeks, I had 500,000 downloads. Now think about this. This is a PowerPoint document about healthcare reform. What could be more boring on earth? And yet 500,000 people are taking the time to look at it, and then the comments start coming in. And the comments are uniform, and believe me, they come from all sides of the political spectrum. They all start the same way. They say, "Thank you, Dan, for having clarified the essentials of the debate. Now I feel informed enough to make my own decisions about where on the spectrum I sit." And I thought, wow, isn't that remarkable? And then it got picked up by the Huffington Post, the online news service, and then it went really viral. We're getting millions of downloads and comments coming in. And then one day in San Francisco, I get a call from Fox News. And Fox says, "Dan, since you are clearly one of America's leading thinkers on healthcare reform, would you be willing to come on air and share your drawings with the American public?" And I said, absolutely. Fox invited me out to New York at 5:15 Eastern Time. Fox Business News Channel gave me 7 minutes to walk through a remarkable amount of time. It was pretty incredible to be able to do that. And for me, I'm thinking, wow, I'm the guy who 3 weeks ago knew nothing. Now I'm broadcasting nationally because I found the form of the idea. Remember our rule? The person who finds the underlying visual form of the idea is the person who's going to win, because you are the person who's going to be understood. The next day after my Fox presentation, I get another call, and they say, "Dan, is this the Dan who drew those back of the napkin stories on pictures on healthcare reform?" And I said, "It is." And they said, "We need to talk." So I was invited out here to go, and of course nobody ever, as a consultant, I don't know how many of you have ever had a chance to get inside the White House. I've never been in the White House. I have had a chance now on 3 occasions to work with the White House Office of Communications, New Media Division, who were the people who first picked up this on the Huffington Post and then on Fox News. You work in the Eisenhower office building, of course, next door, but it still makes a better picture to say, you know. It's still the White House, right? The office it's the extreme East Wing, I guess. So the point I want to make is that there are people in the White House who have gravitated towards this idea of trying to make things more clear by making them vivid, by making them visual, and it was fun to be able to participate. Fun is an understatement. It was encouraging and exciting to me to realize this visual communication style clearly does resonate, and I knew it would. There are neurobiological reasons why this stuff works. To go from knowing nothing in a short period of time to being able to work with the highest people in the land on this is pretty remarkable testament to how powerful it is if you can draw out your idea. And as you've seen, my pictures were not pretty. Doesn't require any kind of artistic talent. So there is something now called the White House Whiteboard, whitehouse.gov/whiteboard. I don't know if anybody's had a chance to look at it, but people will go on the whiteboard and then map out complex ideas of policy. Which brings us back to vivid thinking. visual, verbal, interdependent. Great, Dan, nice mnemonic. How are we going to do it? This is the one actual PowerPoint-like slide I have in my entire presentation, so I'll let you just cogitate on this for a moment. We can just read some bullet points. Here's what vivid thinking really does. It really boils down to two ideas. The first one is we haven't really explored an idea until we've had a chance to both talk about it and look at it, the words and the pictures. Nor can we really share an idea unless we have the ability to both talk about it and to draw it. That's what I mean by interdependent. We're of two minds. Here's a little bit of the neurobiological basis behind this thinking. And I'm not talking about just right brain and left brain. How many people in here are familiar with this idea of right brain thinking and left brain thinking? Has everybody heard about that? It's gotten a little bit too overhyped. It turns out that, of course, our brain, not surprisingly, is far more sophisticated than simply saying we have a verbal side and a visual side and a word side and a picture side. It's a lot more sophisticated and subtle than that. But for the most part, it is true that human beings, uniquely among all mammals, have two lobes of the neocortex. All mammals do. As far as we can tell, humans are the only mammal in which the underlying processes that take place in the two hemispheres are different. In all other mammals, they appear to be mirrored. In humans, they are different. And we do have one part of our mind that is focused at looking at the world as little bits. It is the part of our mind whose job it is to look at the world as the little pieces, the words, the dots. Then we have another part of our mind whose job it is to glue everything together, that looks at the whole, that does look at the pictures. We could loosely refer to these as a verbal mind and a visual mind, and we all have both of them. I want to show you how powerful the visual one is. We know how powerful the verbal one is because we've spent so much time with it. The way we're going to test this is I'm going to show you a series of simple pictures. There will be 4 of them, and I don't want anyone to stress out. This is not a test. I'm just going to show you 4 pictures. They're going to look similar, and all I want you to do by yourself is just look at them and see if you can see that there are some things in these pictures. So, does everyone agree? Can everybody see that there are some things in these pictures? Okay? That's picture A. I'm now going to go on to picture B, and I'm going to go back and forth a little bit. This is picture B. I'm going to go back to A now for a moment. This is A. Ahead to B. I'm going to do it one more time, and this time as we look at A and we shift to B, I want to ask you, how much time do you think might have passed between picture A and picture B? How much time do you think might have passed? Anyone have any idea? I hear seconds. Some number of seconds. Okay. I'm going to now continue on to picture C. Clearly, most of us see that something else has happened. And now I'm going to go on to the last picture, picture D, the last one in the series. Oh, something else happened. Do we all agree that something else happened? I'm going to go back to C one more time because I want to do a parallel question. Between C and D, how much time do we think passed? Hours. How do we know that? Rhetorical question. We didn't say a word. We just saw our visual mind kick into gear. It's what we do thousands of times a second. We look at the world, we make sense out of it based on what we've seen. And I can pretty much guarantee, if I did ask you to describe what you had just seen, every one of us would have pretty much the same rough description of what we just witnessed. The little girl who lost her dog because of the birds. We didn't need the words to know what happened. The words are nice to contain it. The words are nice to describe it, but they are not required to understand it. And that's where we're getting ourselves a little bit tripped up. We did all of that without saying a word. Here's what we're going to do for the rest of the time. I've presented the idea. Here's my theory. Vivid thinking works well. And what I'd like to do is I promised you that we're going to make a tool. I would like each of you now to take one of the paper napkins that you have on your table. Grab a pen, and for the next 17 minutes, we are together going to create a picture that will help us make sure that every idea we have from now on is a vivid idea. So here's what I'd like you to do. Is everybody got their equipment? Has everybody got their napkin and something to write with? We're all good? Everybody's got a pen and a napkin? I'd like you along the top of your napkin to label it. This is my idea. I'd like you to label the top of your napkin, my idea. Then we're going to start our picture, and we start every problem-solving picture the same way. We do not start by saying, I can't draw. We do not start by saying, I wouldn't know what to draw even if I could. And we do not start by saying, I know the solution. What we do is we simply draw a little circle. I would like everyone to draw a little circle in the upper left-hand corner of your napkin. Now we don't have to worry about what we're going to draw anymore because it's already started. Then the next step, remember this is vivid, so it's visual and verbal. We did the visual part, now we do the verbal part. Give it a name. I want you to call it me. And for a little extra credit, go ahead and make that circle look a little bit like you. Anybody need help? We're good so far? Because now what I'd like you to do, we're going to push this. The visual thinking engine is started. And once we start to unleash it, we're not going to be able to slow it down. What I'd like us to do is draw another circle and give it another name at the bottom. And I'd like us to call the second circle my audience. In this case, I drew a little picture of my mom because I'm always trying to explain to my mom what the heck it is that I do. So here's my idea. We've got two circles. That's the way we start the picture. We draw a circle, we give it a name. Then we draw another circle, we give that one a name. If I've named the first one this, what would I name the second one? Well, now let's do a third one. I want to make a bigger circle in the middle of our napkin. That circle doesn't need a label because that circle is my idea. The goal now in vivid thinking is to make sure that I can describe my idea in a way that makes sure I really know it, so that I can explain it super clearly to my audience. Now, my idea is kind of big and round right now, but that's going to be kind of tough to explain. So what I'd like to do is say, we don't solve problems by trying to solve the whole thing at once. We don't eat a pizza by eating the whole thing at once. We slice it up into slices. I want us to take our idea and slice it up into 6 slices. Go ahead and cut your circle in half, and then the other part into thirds, just like you were slicing up a pizza. And now what we can do is we can take apart our idea in a way that we can digest it step by step. Is everybody with me so far? Here comes the magic step now. We're going to shift from the visual back to the verbal, and we are going to label each slice. I'd like us to start with our slice in the upper right and label it F. The next slice is O. Then comes R, working our way around, E, S, and T. What does that spell? Forest. This is the picture that's going to help us see the forest and the trees. We're going to see the whole and we're going to see the bits at the same time. This is my mnemonic. If you do have a chance to read through your books, blah, 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 you're going to find that the forest mnemonic represents about 3/4 of the book. This is the tool that we use as a checklist to make sure that our idea is actually vivid. What I mean by that is we're going to start. F stands for form. The person who finds the form of the idea, the structure of the idea, who can take something that was vague and amorphous and give it a shape, like maybe a little square, is the person who's already the furthest along in clarifying their idea. We need to find the form of the idea. What do I mean by that? Well, here's the form of a bicycle. Here is the form of human emotion, human feeling. What I mean by that is this is a really interesting chart. This is something called the Wong-Baker Faces Pain Rating Scale. This was developed by 2 doctors, Dr. Wong and Dr. Baker, for use in emergency rooms and hospitals around the world where there is a language gap. And the thought was, could we create a chart that would allow a patient to communicate with a doctor with nothing more than pointing at pictures that completely bypasses spoken language? The really remarkable part about this chart is this has been tested, I believe, in almost every country on earth. And if you really wanted to distill down what it is like in the most simple level to feel something as a human, it's going to look like that. You can take this chart to any country on earth, and people are going to understand equally what each one of those little forms means. It's pretty remarkable. So there we had a bicycle, we had feelings. How about something maybe a little bit more abstract? What is the form of money? Now, this one, without my super-duper laser pointer, Joe, is there a laser pointer in this? There is. All right, good, okay. So what I'd like you to do is, this is actually my vivid reconstruction of a book called The Ascent of Money by a fellow named Neil Ferguson. Neil Ferguson is a British historian, economist, very smart guy, has written lots and lots of books on how the world works. And I thought his books are so brilliant, wouldn't it make sense to take his underlying great idea and make it vivid so we could see it? So here's the history of money. It starts out in the beginning, money equaled metal. The Spaniards found a whole bunch of silver when they came to the New World. They took that silver back to Europe, and that became the basis of most of Europe's economy, the silver that was being pulled out of the New World. Well, but metal always runs out. So something new has to come up. So they invented credit. Credit is the idea of extending you money when you don't actually have it. It's based on trust. Money moves away from metal and moves to trust. And then if you look over the history of money, the first thing that came along was the development of banks by the Medicis in Italy, what is now Italy, who were able to find a way to give credit to kings. Then not too much longer, you had bonds, which was developed by the Rothschilds, that was a way to give money to nations. And then not too long after that, you had stocks come along, which was a way to extend credit to business. And not long after that, you had insurance come along, which was a way to extend credit to groups. And after that, with the New Deal, for the most part in the United States, you had real estate become a viable market, which is a way to extend credit to people who don't have enough money to buy a house. It's all based on trust. There you have it, in a very vivid way, a reconstruction of what Neil Ferguson said is the history of money, which leaves us today in a position where money is not metal, money is all about trust. And what was remarkable is I pulled this picture up again yesterday and thinking about showing it to you, is I started to think about the situation we have in the world right now. We know that there's fiscal crisis going on as we speak. It's not getting better, it's getting worse. If you look at this picture, it's almost like a devolution. We've lost trust. What was the first part of the market to go? It was real estate. After real estate went, who was next? AIG. The insurance companies started to go. After the insurance companies start to go, you get free fall in the stock market. Where are we right now? Nations are failing. The bonds are going. Who's next? I gave a talk earlier this morning. There were some people from the FDIC, and we realized your job is coming. It's kind of a scary thought because, what has gold been doing lately? In lack of trust and with fear, people have been hoarding gold again. We're moving backwards in that economic model of what money means. Pretty scary thought. I'm going to move on to something happier. So we're going to go on. Okay, we've got 9 minutes. We're going to make it around this pizza. The next one, because form was the most important one of the 6 pieces. If we can find the form of our idea, we will be able to explain any idea to anybody. Einstein, granted one of the smartest people of the last several hundred years, do you know Einstein, when he was a baby, didn't talk? Einstein didn't say his first word until he was 2.5 years old. Einstein's nanny had a word for Albert. She called him stupid. It's pretty ironic to think that he didn't talk. Most babies are talking, at least saying something by the time they're 9 months or a year. Einstein didn't say a word until he was 2.5. And the words that he said, pretty crazy story. So it turns out that when young baby Albert was approaching 2 years old, his mother became pregnant again. And his mother was telling him, Albert, you're going to have a new toy coming along, referring to the second child that was going to be born, so that Albert would be ready when he suddenly had a young sibling. So sure enough, 9 months pass, and the mother goes to the hospital, and she has a little baby daughter. And she brings the daughter home to Albert, who's never said a word in his life. They think that he's got severe learning differences. They brought in doctors to try to diagnose what might be his problem, but Albert refuses to talk. They bring the baby in, and they show the baby to Albert, and Albert says, "If that's my new toy, where are the wheels?" The first words, Albert wasn't stupid. Albert was just waiting until he had the full thought put together in his mind. To his dying day, Einstein would always say, "I never think in words. I don't use words at all. I see in images." And then I have to go through this laborious process of trying to translate the images that I saw into calculations and words so that I can communicate them in the way that the establishment has told me that I have to, even though I know I don't need to do it that way. Because when I draw relativity with pictures, I show people the form, everybody understands it. That's why form's important. O, only is the essentials. When we want to introduce an idea, we go back to something I learned when I was working with the Naval War College. I don't know how many of you in here are familiar with the term bluff. I see you in uniform down there. Are you familiar with the term bluff? When you want to deliver a message, bottom line up front. When you're that radar dude and you've got a whole bunch of bogeys coming in, the last thing you want to do is describe everything that you're seeing. What you want to do is say, what does it mean? What is the bottom line? Say that first. And then if your captain or if the person, your audience is interested in what you've led them with, they will give you all the time in the world to explain the details. Back to my concerns about some of the communication on healthcare, we needed the vision first, then we can get into the details. Bottom line up front, I think there has never been a better example of a vision statement given by a leader in the history of the world than when Kennedy, again, I'm a big Kennedy fan, said, I believe we should commit this nation before this decade is out to landing a man on the moon and bringing him safely back to Earth. That is the best vision statement that has ever been given because every one of us could walk outside at night and look and say, that is exactly where we're going. Now, granted, with something like healthcare or the global economy, it's much more challenging because there is no single target. But my gosh, wouldn't it be wonderful if there was? Because think about what this nation can do when it sees what it needs to achieve. We can get galvanized and we will move together to achieve that objective without any doubt whatsoever. We just need to know what the objective is. Bottom line up front. R, our third slice, recognizable. What I mean by this is the human mind, by the time we're about 5 years old, we've pretty much stopped learning anything new. We continue to learn a lot of new things. We learn details and facts and how to read and all kinds of great things. But our mind, by the time we're about 5, has already seen pretty much everything it's willing to accept. And for the rest of our lives, what we're doing is we're rationalizing what we see now to what we learned when we were infants. We're looking for the recognizable. If we want people to understand our idea, we make it look like something they've seen before. This is a photo of what? What is that a photo? It's the ocean. That's a nice photo of a blue ocean. Now, doesn't that look like an inviting place to go? We just know that there's all kinds of interesting things waiting for us out there if we could go explore that. The most successful business book in the last 10 years is a book called Blue Ocean Strategy. The book has nothing to do with oceans. The authors, who were incredibly smart, put together a magnificently smart book. But even smarter, in my opinion, was the fact that they decided to name their underlying concept after something that we innately understand. The invitation, the excitement of a blue ocean. This is the #1 selling business book of the last 10 years, for the most part, of a hardcore business book. It's recognizable. Even though the concepts are new, we recognize what they're about. E stands for evolving. A good idea, a vivid idea, is one that doesn't suddenly appear out of nowhere. Because it's coming from something we recognize, it's something that has the opportunity to evolve over time. The first parachute was designed by Leonardo da Vinci. It took 300 years for anybody to use it. The parachute has made incremental evolutionary steps ever since over the last, 600 years, but it's still essentially the same idea. S stands for spans differences. This means that when we make a vivid idea, we do not reject what the other side says. On the contrary, we do exactly the opposite. We embrace what the other side says. We test our idea openly with the input from the people who would disagree with it, because a vivid idea is one that doesn't say it's either this or this. It says we're going to find the way to do both. The best example is this. It has been gospel for 100 years that if you were going to build a car, you had two choices, and it was completely binary. You could either build a car that was efficient, or you could build a car that was powerful. And as long as we relied on the internal combustion engine, that was true. We no longer rely on the internal combustion engine. It is now possible, because of the people at Tesla and others, to say, wait a minute. It's not that the underlying binary decision is to make a car that's either efficient or powerful. Why don't we make a car that is both efficient and powerful? And the way to do that is we'll give it an electric engine. And all of a sudden, you've got a car that gets infinitely better gas mileage even than a Mini and has more power than a Hummer. How is that possible? Because the solution spans the two differences. It doesn't reject them. It embraces both and brings them together. And our last one is targeted, and then I will wrap this up right on time. A vivid idea is one that knows its audience. Remember, I was trying to communicate what I do to my mom. When I showed mom my chart of the forest and the trees, Mom was very pleased. She got it. She said, "That's brilliant. My son, that's brilliant." So I want your audience to say the same thing about you. Your idea is so clear, it is so vivid, it has form, you can deliver it bottom line up front, it's recognizable. I've seen something like this before. Yes, thank you. It evolves, it changes over time. It's not only this. It allows it to include the opposites, and it's targeted. And I want to close with a couple of pictures that I've been drawing. These are actually for CNN. CNN has asked me to make some illustrations to go along with the stories that they're going to start to cover now that the Supreme Court has said it's going to hear the cases on health care. So here's one way of looking at health care. Uncle Sam is coming in and very happily moving the uninsured into the insured. Well, depending on who you're targeting, that can either be a message which is positive or a message which is perceived as negative. And I think one of the problems, again, just to bemoan healthcare because it's such a poster child of what could have perhaps been done differently, half the populace says, yes, that's wonderful. It is the role of government to help me. The other half says, government can't tell me what to do. The message, had it been more effectively targeted, perhaps might not have ended up with the unhappy states that are now forcing it to go into the Supreme Court. And these are the last two pictures. I hope I've left you with some nice thoughts about vivid thinking, visual thinking, why it is that combining our verbal and our visual mind will help us be much more clear. I hope your little napkin picture will help you apply it in the future. And the real question is, why did this begin? Why is it that we have a mind that can both process words and pictures? Because words were really important way back in the old days. The pictures were what helped us see the thing that was about to eat us. And I think that that's still true today. The pictures are what help us see and avoid the thing that's trying to eat us. It's your turn. From now on, I would like you, when you face an idea, to go ahead and map it out, make it as vivid as you can, and I guarantee you will understand it better, as will that audience. I want to thank you so much. This is really fun for me to share this with you. Thank you. Hey, Tom. Hey, thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That was terrific.
Good.
And I want you to know I'm converted. So from this point forward, Government Executive Magazine is going to be published on napkins. Thank you very much. I hope at this point all of you will join us for what I like to think of as my favorite part of the day, the dessert break in the atrium. We'll return to this hall at 4 o'clock for our final keynote speaker of the day after our afternoon sessions, OMB's Shelley Metzenbaum. And then I hope after that you'll stay for the really fun part, which is the cocktail reception, which will also be in this room. Thanks.